October 1929, the stock market collapsed, and with it, any illusion that America's prosperity would last forever. Banks failed, businesses closed, factories shut down. Men who'd worked the same jobs for 20 years found themselves standing in unemployment lines that stretched for blocks, and those lines led nowhere because there were no jobs to give. By the winter of 1930, Chicago was starving, not metaphorically, actually starving. Families who'd been middle class 6 months ago were now wondering where their next meal would come from. Children went to bed hungry. Elderly people who'd saved their whole lives watched their savings evaporate and found themselves choosing between rent and food. The Great Depression had arrived, and it was cruel and indiscriminate and overwhelming. The government's response was inadequate. President Hoover insisted the economy would fix itself, that private charity would fill the gaps, that government intervention would only make things worse. Meanwhile, in Chicago alone, thousands of families were going without food. Soup kitchens run by churches and charities couldn't keep up with the demand. The lines grew longer every day. And then on November 27, 1930, Thanksgiving Day, Al Capone announced he was opening a soup kitchen. Not a small one, not a token gesture. A massive operation on South State Street that would serve 3 meals a day every day to anyone who needed it. No questions asked, no judgments made, just food, free food for as many people as showed up. The newspapers loved it. Capone feeds the hungry. The headlines read, "Scarface Al where government fails." The public loved it too, or at least they loved the food. They loved that someone, anyone, was actually doing something while their government told them to wait and hope and believe things would get better on their own. What they didn't know yet was why Capone was doing it, and when they found out, it would raise questions that nobody was comfortable answering. The idea came from Jack Guzik, Capone's financial advisor, and one of the few men whose counsel Capone actually listened to. They were sitting in Capone's office at the Lexington Hotel in October 1930, going over the accounts, when Guzik brought it up. "We need to do something about your image," Guzik said carefully. "The Valentine's Day thing. It's been almost 2 years and people still—" "I know," Capone interrupted. He knew exactly what Guzik meant. The St. Valentine's Day massacre in February 1929 had destroyed the carefully cultivated image of Capone as America's charming gangster. 7 men machine-gunned to death had turned folk hero into monster overnight, and nothing Capone had tried since had made any difference. "The public hates me," Capone said flatly. "They've decided I'm the devil. Fine, what am I supposed to do about it?" "Help them," Guzik said. "The depression, people are starving. The government isn't helping. If you help." Capone looked at him. "You want me to feed people? I want you to feed people very publicly, very generously, and very consistently. Make it impossible for them to hate you when you're the one keeping their children from going hungry." Capone was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then, "How much would it cost?" "A lot. But Al, you've got money. More money than you can spend. And right now money can buy something more valuable than anything else." "What's that?" "Redemption." The first soup kitchen opened on South State Street on Thanksgiving Day, 1930. Capone spared no expense. Long tables set up in a storefront he'd rented specifically for this purpose. Industrial kitchens in the back with professional cooks hired from closed-down restaurants. Hot meals, not scraps or leftovers, but real Thanksgiving dinner. Turkey with gravy, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, apple pie for dessert, and hot coffee. Not the thin gruel or stale bread that other charities distributed. Real food, the kind of meal a family might serve in their own home if they had the money for it. Enough to actually fill a stomach, to remind people what it felt like to be satisfied. Capone himself showed up for the opening at 10 a.m., dressed in an expensive 3-piece suit as always, his famous scar visible even in the morning light. He stationed himself beside the serving line, not hidden away in a back office, but right there where the photographers and reporters he'd invited could capture everything. He wanted this documented. Wanted the world to see Al Capone, the man newspapers called public enemy number 1, personally serving plates of food to grateful families. The line formed hours before the kitchen opened. By 8 a.m., more than 500 people were already waiting, stamping their feet against the November cold. Men in worn coats that had been expensive once before they'd lost their jobs months ago. Women with children clinging to their skirts, the children's faces thin and pale from weeks of insufficient food. Elderly people who'd worked their whole lives, saved carefully. Imagine they'd end up standing in a charity line at 70 years old. There was a certain shame to it, the visible admission that you couldn't feed your own family, that you needed help from anyone who'd give it. But the shame was being overwhelmed by something more powerful, hunger. When your stomach is empty and your children are crying and you haven't had a proper meal in days, pride becomes a luxury you can't afford. When the doors opened at 10 a.m., the line moved steadily. Volunteers served the food, local men and women who'd either been hired by Capone or had volunteered because they believed in the mission. Capone himself stood at the beginning of the line, greeting people, shaking hands, making sure the photographers captured him personally handing plates to families. "Thank you," people said as Capone handed them plates, their voices thick with genuine emotion. "God bless you, Mr. Capone. Thank you so much." One woman, elderly with white hair and arthritic hands, gripped Capone's hand and wouldn't let go. Tears streamed down her weathered face. "My grandchildren are going to eat tonight because of you. The government, they told us to wait, told us things would get better, but they did nothing, and you saved us. You saved my babies." Capone smiled for the cameras, but something in the woman's desperate gratitude seemed to touch him. "Nobody goes hungry in my city," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "Nobody, not while I can do something about it." A man named Thomas Brennan, 42 years old, former machinist at a factory that had closed in June, stood in line with his wife and 3 children. The oldest child, a girl of 9. Hadn't had a full meal in 2 weeks. When Brennan reached Capone and received his family's plates, he found himself unable to speak. Just nodded, tears in his eyes, and took the food to a table where his daughter ate like she'd never tasted anything so good. By the end of that first day, they'd served nearly 2,000 meals. The newspapers ran photos of Capone serving food, of grateful families eating, of children with full plates for the first time in weeks. The headlines were exactly what Guzik had hoped for. Capone where Hoover fails, Scarface Al feeds Chicago's hungry, gangster shows more compassion than government. For a brief, glorious moment, it worked. Public opinion shifted. Not completely, people didn't forget the Valentine's Day massacre, but they softened, started seeing Capone as more complicated than just evil, started asking uncomfortable questions about a system where a gangster was doing more to help starving families than the President of the United States. The soup kitchens became an institution. Not just one, Capone opened 3 more across Chicago over the next few months. By spring 1931, his operation was serving 3,000 meals a day, every single day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. To anyone who showed up, the cost was staggering. Estimates ranged from $12, $0 to $15, $0 a day, something like $250, $0 in modern money. Capone paid for all of it out of his own pocket, or rather out of the Chicago outfit's profits from bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution. But he paid it consistently without complaint for over a year. The people who came to the soup kitchens were desperate. These weren't people looking for a free handout. These were families who'd done everything right, worked hard, saved money, lived responsible lives, and had been crushed by economic forces beyond their control. The Depression didn't discriminate. It took everyone. Robert Henderson was a factory worker who'd been laid off in January 1930. He had a wife and 3 children. By November, they'd exhausted their savings, pawned everything valuable, and were facing eviction. When Capone's soup kitchen opened, Henderson swallowed his pride and got in line. "I never thought I'd be taking charity from a gangster," he told a reporter who was documenting the soup kitchen operations. "But my kids were hungry, my wife was hungry. What was I supposed to do? The government said to wait, that things would get better, but you can't eat promises." Stories like Henderson's were everywhere. Families who'd been comfortable 6 months ago, now dependent on Al Capone for their daily food, and they were genuinely grateful. Some of them loved him for it. "Mr. Capone cares about us," one mother said. "He sees we're suffering and he does something. The politicians just talk. Mr. Capone acts." For Capone, it was vindication. Finally, people were seeing him the way he saw himself, as someone who helped the community, who understood working people, who cared about ordinary families. The criminal part, that was just business. This was real, this mattered, or so he told himself. The backlash started slowly, then built into a roar. It began with the Chicago Tribune running an editorial titled, "Whose Money is Feeding Chicago?" The article didn't deny that Capone was helping people. Didn't question that families were eating because of him. Instead, it asked a simpler, more damning question: where was the money coming from? Every meal served in Capone's soup kitchens is paid for with money from illegal gambling, bootlegging, and prostitution, the editorial read. Every turkey dinner, every bowl of soup, every piece of bread funded by crime. When you accept food from Al Capone, you're accepting the profits of vice. You're eating meals purchased with money extorted from working people, money taken from addicts and gamblers, money earned by women selling their bodies. The article continued, yes, people are hungry. Yes, the government's response has been inadequate. But does that desperation justify accepting blood money? Does hunger excuse participating in a publicity stunt designed to rehabilitate the image of a man who ordered 7 men machine-gunned to death? Al Capone isn't feeding Chicago out of compassion. He's feeding Chicago because he needs us to forget what he is. Other newspapers picked up the theme. Federal prosecutors gave statements reminding people that Capone was under investigation for tax evasion, that his charitable spending was likely funded by illegal operations, that accepting his charity was, in some moral sense, accepting the fruits of organized crime. Mr. Capone is not a philanthropist, one prosecutor said in a press conference. He's a criminal trying to buy redemption. Every person who praises him for his soup kitchens is helping him do that. The criticism put the people using the soup kitchens in an impossible position. They were hungry, their children were hungry, Capone was offering food. But accepting that food meant accepting help from a gangster, meant being part of his image. Rehabilitation meant, according to the critics, eating meals purchased with blood money. Some people stopped coming to the soup kitchens, pride and principle overriding hunger, but most kept coming, because hunger isn't abstract. Hunger is immediate and physical and desperate. And when your children are crying because they're hungry, philosophical questions about the morality of where the food comes from become luxuries you can't afford. Yes, I know it's blood money, one father told a reporter, feeding his young daughter soup from Capone's kitchen. I know who Al Capone is, I know what he's done, but look at my daughter, look at her eating. Tell me I should let her go hungry because the money came from bootlegging. Tell me that's the moral choice. The reporter had no answer. The paradox was profound and uncomfortable. Al Capone, a violent criminal who'd built an empire on vice and intimidation, was doing more to help Chicago's poor than the government. Families were eating because of him. Children who would have gone hungry were being fed, and all of it was funded by the same illegal operations that had made him notorious. Was that good? Was that bad? Or was it something more complicated that nobody wanted to examine too closely? The soup kitchens forced Americans to confront questions they preferred to avoid. If a bad man does a good thing for bad reasons, is the thing still good? If the outcome is positive, hungry people fed, does the motivation matter? If the government fails to help its citizens, do those citizens have the right to accept help from criminals? Religious leaders were divided. Some praised Capone, saying that feeding the hungry was a Christian duty regardless of who did it. Others condemned him, saying that sin couldn't be washed away with charity, that his generosity was tainted by its source. Jesus fed the multitudes, one minister said in defense of the soup kitchens. He didn't ask where the fish and loaves came from. He just fed people who were hungry. Jesus didn't fund his ministry with money from prostitution and gambling, another minister countered. There's a difference between divine providence and blood money. Philosophers and ethicists debated it in academic journals. Sociologists studied it. Everyone had an opinion, but nobody could agree on an answer because the question didn't have a clean answer. It was messy and complicated and forced people to confront the gap between their principles and the reality of desperate need. For Capone, the criticism stung more than he wanted to admit. He'd thought feeding 3,000 people a day would redeem him, would make people see him differently. Instead, it sparked debates about the nature of morality and redemption that left him somehow more villainized than before. I'm helping people, he told reporters in one of his rare press conferences. Thousands of people who would be going hungry if not for me. And all anyone wants to talk about is where the money comes from. Well, where's the government's money coming from? Taxes on these same starving families. At least my money is feeding them instead of going to politicians' vacations. It was a fair point, but it didn't change the fundamental problem. Capone was a criminal. His generosity didn't erase the violence, the bootlegging, the deaths, and using that criminal money to feed people didn't sanctify. It just made the moral math more complicated. The soup kitchens continued operating through 1931. 3,000 meals a day, every day, no questions asked. Families kept coming because they needed food, critics kept criticizing because they needed villains, and Capone kept paying because he needed redemption. But redemption remained elusive. In October 1931, Capone was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in prison. As they led him out of the courtroom, a reporter shouted, "What about the soup kitchens? Keep them running," Capone shouted back. "Find someone to keep them running. People need to eat." But without Capone's money and organization, the soup kitchens closed within weeks. Other charities tried to fill the gap, but none had Capone's resources. The 3,000 people who'd been eating daily found themselves back in line at church kitchens, back to insufficient charity, back to hunger. And the question remained, if a gangster's soup kitchens fed more people than the government's programs, what did that say about the gangster? What did it say about the government? What did it say about a society that couldn't figure out how to feed its own people without help from criminals? Years later, historians and ethicists would still debate Capone's soup kitchens. Some called it one of the largest charitable operations of the Depression era. Others called it a cynical PR campaign. Most agreed it was probably both. The people who'd eaten there remembered it simply. "I was hungry," many would say when asked about it decades later. "Capone fed me. Whatever else he was, whatever else he did on that day when I needed food, he gave it to me." I can't hate him for that. Al Capone died in 1947, his legacy forever complicated by contradictions. Violent gangster and charitable benefactor, public enemy number one who fed 3,000 people a day, a man who ordered murders and also kept children from starving. The soup kitchens remained his most confusing legacy, because they forced everyone to confront an uncomfortable truth. Morality isn't simple. Good and evil aren't neat categories. Sometimes bad people do good things. Sometimes good actions come from bad motivations. Sometimes the world is messy and complicated and doesn't offer clean answers. And sometimes, when you're hungry enough, you don't care whether the hand feeding you belongs to a saint or a sinner. You just eat.